Hello, and I hope all is well for you today. My name is Gershly Karen Pierre, and I'm pro-marriage, pro the nuclear family. I enjoy observing human trends, especially when it comes to populations, whether it's population size, the ways populations present, how these things change with time. I just love looking at this world and making sense of my place alongside of it, but just through someone else's choices. And if there's something that I observe, is that this world runs on unity. That there will be naysayers and people who kind of come out and try to change that narrative and have this very wishy-washy, whimsical approach. But that structurally speaking, there's a standard. And that the wishy-washy types do not seem to notice that, or maybe they're just a part of, I can be a bit of a conspiracy theorist, maybe they're just a part of dispersing the idea of catching on to the actual way that this world is constructed. So maybe those people are just playing a role. But from my observation, there is a difference between people groups, and that the group that I happen to be a part of, we are not in a position that is ideal. We're not in a position that benefits us. And as a result, I think we need to structurally begin to see ourselves rather than from the individual approach, but from the group approach, and then creating a standard within that group approach. That it can't just be this anything goes world. We can regulate our behaviors as adults. We can begin to pull the reins for the things that are currently going wrong within us. And my sector of interest is the marriage and family side, the nuclear family and husbands and wives and couples and that structural side, because it leads me to the concept of power. When I look up, and sometimes I don't even think I have to look it up, it's definitely like a taunt being thrown in our faces. It's like a study will come out and the news will report it, and the black race is the least of this and the most of that, but usually in a bad way. So we're the most in a bad way, the least of things that we could have for the good. And so it's a ranking of us always being ultimately in a powerless predicament. And so to constantly see that narrative play out is largely draining, though informative, but mentally taxing. And so it gets really scary to think about the complexities of what we don't have. And sometimes I can feel like, what do we have? But then I really think about it. What do we have? And just the fact that I can even say we is a privilege, because God forbid you're the only person on the planet and you have to go through the same thing, but just by yourself. Now, how compromised would that person be? And I feel like we would still go through the same thing, even if it was just one person alive. Ugh, it's scary to think about. And so what that proves to me is that there is a group of people that I can relate to. That is our power, is that we can relate. Knowing that you're not as an individual going through this. That God gave us a pool of people that we can likewise relate to. Knowing that means, how do we then take that relatability and have it be an advantage? Our power is having someone you can relate to in a world that is trying to convince us that everything you see, everything you know, it's not happening. They're even trying to ban our history. For example, in Florida, the banning of African Americans' history from schools. In different parts of the Caribbean and in different parts of Africa, they're not even teaching the true history of those places at all. What you can see is a world that's trying to make you think that it's all just random, so that you can't properly contextualize the truth, so that you don't ask questions, and that you don't do anything against all the attacks they're trying to do against us. It's a very sneaky method. It's a very spooky method. But it's the kind of thing that's going to have you question your sense of reality. What do you really know? Meanwhile, you're just looking at this series of coincidences that keep happening against you, and so you wouldn't be able to put a name to it if you don't have history to articulate it. But they're trying to make it to that point. So what this world is proving with their many methods, that the Bible is correct, that God is real, that there is a reason this stuff is happening, and the Bible is actually teaching me how to be aware of those things. But it's also teaching me not to trust and rely on them, because when put in positions of power, you'll have leaders banning the truth from even being taught, which means that you don't have my best interests. This world doesn't even want us to have what is called CRT, and they're making it seem like it's so offensive that we would study the race relations. Even if you didn't teach me, I observe what you're doing. So even if you don't teach me, I see it. But it just shows me the fact that they're banning that, the fact that they're offended by that, the fact that they see these things as difficult. It tells me instead of using the power to be informative and heal and benefit people, they're using that power to make our lives even that much more difficult and that much more unlivable, to make us even more confused than we already are. They could care less about us. So with their power, they use it to destroy us. And so if with that power is a total sense of dominance to the point of extremes, it's no wonder that the goal is to gatekeep us from any kind of power. And since this is a pro-marriage, pro-family platform, I believe it is strategic, and I'm going to focus on the family part of this, that they never promote our families at all. They may say, oh, well, it's because statistically there aren't that many of you getting married. But of the few who are, you would think they would become a novelty, and you would be that much more interested to make them a conversation piece. But rather than promoting us at all in ideal ways, the goal is to constantly psychologically manipulate information to promote us in not so ideal ways, so that even though there is bad information, they don't want to show even the exceptions to that. They try to make themselves God. They want to be seen as the gods of the earth, gods of this universe. It's just about whether we consent to having that shared existence together. Because think about it. They didn't take away your ability to make families. You can say that they did, but there isn't a law banning us from getting married. There isn't a law banning people from having intact homes. What if we used that power but to our advantage? So that, and the way that we govern our families is to inform them of the history that your school systems are not going to teach you. So since the school system's not going to do it, what if we govern our families in the sense of teaching them this stuff ourselves? We have to make it a duty and a responsibility to teach them the truth. Because if we're being honest, that history, it even goes all the way back to the Bible. So it's being able to share that and all the ways they've done things is a good thing, because if we don't teach them their history, we don't contextualize them. I also think if the families are our governments and they are in our power and in our control, that it should be like a ministry, that we make more of it, because these people, they can be resourceful for us. What they have, what they know, what they're good at, but also they themselves, they become our resource that we should harvest so that we're not going into this earth alone. If it was just one person and the same norms continued, we would be incredibly compromised. I don't think anyone would care to help that one person. But technically we're creating that pattern since we're so vulnerable and divided. So what we should do is be merging family groups so that we can create allies, so that we can become less vulnerable in the conditions that this world is creating for us, which are very tormenting and spooky. And it reminds me of a scary movie, the things that I believe they have planned and that they are doing right before our eyes. But to go through that alone and without someone that you can somehow empathize with is really discomforting. And we shouldn't make it like that. I observed that throughout our history, whenever we would get together and unite, things would become accomplished that previously we could have only hoped for. That it took unity to get those things to happen. And that tells me two things about unity. Number one, that's the solution to our difficulties, is within. And number two, that other groups would never have made those things happen. Think about the revolutions that were fought. Think about the rebellions that were waged. Think about the boycotts and so on and so forth, things that happened when people began to unite. Do you think those things would have happened with the other groups? That they would have just come out and say, you know what? I want things to change, so let us unite for the greater good, make them change? No. They have the power to do that, they just don't. And it's proven because slavery in some places ended because of revolutions, and in other places only ended after hundreds of years. We're not talking 10 years, we're talking hundreds of years of things that just kept going. So that proves if people didn't get together and say, we have to change this, it wouldn't happen. And more precisely, if our people specifically, because they were the ones going through it, they were the ones that understood it, so they had to fight against their circumstances. But it wouldn't have happened if they didn't do it. So it's scary to think that this stuff that we see that is circling around us would just keep going, and that people who say that it's a big deal are rare in the other groups, and even in some cases work with the things that are hurting us. So what's scary is knowing that when the world is against you, it's truly against you. But that your allies, when they're for you, they're for you. And so we have power in unity. We have power instead of being vulnerable as a demographic in concentrating our numbers like a wall of defense, qualitatively shaping us so that we know who are our allies, and especially if they're within us, we know why they are our allies, because we have a shared interest and a shared set of controversy within the world that has made us their enemies. No one who is outside of us is being affected by what is affecting us. So I'm not going to spend 3,000 years trying to help you understand something that A, benefits you, B, that is part of your families, is part of your people, and who you can intellectualize as belonging to you somehow, and that you are part of. Rather than that, let's see the shared sense of oneness that we too have, but within us, because we collectively understand the undermining of our experience. And even if you don't collectively understand it, you're still not free from the consequence of your lack of understanding. So lack of understanding doesn't mean that it's not going to affect you. When unity happens, change happens. When unity doesn't happen, no one comes to our defense. Even if they join the movements, that's not the same as initiating it and pushing it to the forefront. It took us standing together, because whatever the motive as to why things don't happen, people may join things, but that's not the same thing as pushing it. What is the motive why they never pushed it? They had the power to do it. I don't know why they won't do it. There could be many reasons, but it won't be advantageous for us until we decide to make a change like we've always done. But this time, by tinkering things so that it actually is in our favor, and in a way that is large scale, like taking into consideration all these points in time and saying, okay, this is what happened, and tinkering it this time for the good. The missing link here, the God factor here, is what we've never tried, the supernatural meeting the natural and the strategic. The power in our control is our families. We have to inform them. We have to teach them the truth, and we have to even make them. And that is a big power when we really cumulatively consider it. The power of distributing ourselves as human resources to each other, the power of having allies. That's a pretty big power, especially since a lot of our movements weren't made because we were infrastructurally dominant, but because we used ourselves as human resources. So it made things come about. I want to put some fact check information regarding my database. In my return from my hiatus video, I talked about the families I discovered. And from now on, I would love to do counts of how many families, what those would be. This is not to replace the data around our families, so that I have given those percentages in other content. That data is incredibly relevant, and we should keep track of that. I think it's good to keep track of these numbers, to observe how much the world we observe matches the data. It helps me visualize what those numbers are, rather than just hearing numbers. It helps me make sense of the who within those numbers. I have the notes, so I went back at that video and I really tried to determine if that information was correct. And I corrected it in the comment section of that video. I had 2020 and 2022 as the dates that I discovered the families. And it's actually, that's not true. I misquoted that even back when I posted the count of the families. I even put in the caption, it's January 3rd, 2020, but it was January 3rd, 2022 at that point. So let me give you the actual information. And so I began the database on November 18th, 2021. And I began it with 5 families. And on January 3rd, 2022, wrongly quoted as January 3rd, 2020, I discovered 148 families. Then on March 24th, 2022, I discovered 423 families. On December 29th, 2022, I had 961 families. And I love fact checking to see typos or whatever I've mistaken. What I find really beautiful about fact checking this information, other than being able to correct myself. So I apologize earnestly for the gaffe. But what I love about fact checking, and what I found through the fact checking, is that from January 3rd to March 24th to December 29th is 1 year. And in 1 year, I discovered a latter portion of 2021 all the way to the latter portion of 2022, I discovered from 5 families to 961 families. So what does this prove? Number one, that if I can do it, what's the excuse of the media entities who have even more power, even more knowledge, even more reach, and even more data to say that they can't promote our families in media? what is their excuse? With the power they have, why don't they use it ever to illustrate good things about us? Whether it's in fictional or non-fictional formats. You ever wonder that? Number 2, what this proves, that omission of us makes it difficult for us to even conceive that we exist. So it makes it difficult for us to galvanize upon our existence. Number 3, this proves that if we were to discover things within ourselves, how much more could we then use that, but to our advantage? That discovering aspects of ourselves promotes increase. There's more about this world than we realized, and this world is trying to keep us from knowing that. Unity is power. Family is power. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Gershly Karen Pierre. I'm pro-marriage and pro the nuclear family. Stay tuned for more.